Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. I'm Jeff Rathke, president of the American-German Institute, and we are really pleased to offer a discussion today on a topic that I think probably could not be more timely for anyone following the strategic considerations in the United States and Europe, stock valuations, earnings reports, talks of bubbles or not bubbles, and the transformation of the Western economy and indeed the global economy through the application of technology. So I'm really happy to hand things over to my colleague, AGI Vice President Peter Rashish, who's also the director of our geoeconomics program, and he will lead us through the session. Peter, over to you.
Thank you, Jeff, and welcome to all of you who have tuned in today to this webinar. We're pleased to have Jakob Hensing, a DAAD AGI Research Fellow with us, who's also based at the Global Public Policy Institute in Berlin. I think that, as Jeff mentioned, today's topic couldn't really be more timely. The European Union, as we've seen, is becoming increasingly concerned about its tech dependencies. These are primarily about China, as we saw in the recent case with Nexperia, the Chinese-owned and Dutch-based chip maker that the Dutch government took over due to national security concerns, as well as the impact of the new U.S. affiliates rule. But we've also seen with the advent of the Trump administration that the United States is also in the EU focus, as the White House's emphasis on power projection has come to encompass tech policy and the role of U.S. tech industries. And this dependency on the United States was brought home to me personally, and probably to many of you who are watching today, when on Tuesday I was not able to reach a UK-based website from my office in Washington owing to an outage at a major U.S. cloud services firm. And then, as if to reinforce the point, this network event happened on the same day that the Franco-German Summit on European Digital Sovereignty was taking place in Berlin. So I think it'll be important to watch whether these two countries that have historically been the motor of European unity are in some kind of ongoing way revving up their cooperation again, this time driven by concerns about European tech dependencies. So again, I'm very glad we could have Jakob Hensing with us to discuss these and other tech policy dynamics. Let me introduce him briefly. As I mentioned, he's a DAAD AGI Research Fellow with his permanent position at GPPI in Berlin. There he focuses on the intersection of economic security, the intersection of economic and security policy. His work explores how power and security considerations are reshaping the global economy, especially in terms of competition and collaboration on emerging technologies. Before GPPI, he worked for more than 5 years as a management consultant at McKinsey & Company and also at Orphos Public, which is McKinsey's public sector branch in Germany. Jakob holds a doctorate in politics and a master's in international relations from the University of Oxford, as well as a bachelor's degree from Jakobs University in Bremen. After Jakob's presentation, I will moderate a discussion with him and also look forward to taking your questions. So if you do have a question, please use the Q&A button on the screen and we'll get them to Jakob. So Jakob, with that, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much, Jeff and Peter, for these introductions. And maybe before I kind of start sharing my screen and delve into the content, let me thank the American-German Institute and the DAAD for really enabling this stay here in DC. I've been here since the beginning of September and still have a few weeks left. And for me, this has really been an extraordinarily useful kind of period in terms of understanding the way that the US discussion on these matters is evolving and what it really means from a European perspective. I've been in that slightly awkward position to kind of work on topics where kind of questions of US-China competition and kind of US policy in general are just integral to kind of anything happening in that field, and at the same time not having had kind of spent extensive period working on these topics sitting in the US. So in that sense, that was really an extraordinary opportunity. So, I mean, with that, let me share my screen and then basically get into it. And I think, as both Jeff and Peter have highlighted, kind of the starting point of the study is a topic that certainly doesn't kind of count among kind of the easier areas in the transatlantic relationship at the moment. So, I mean, basically the starting point was this observation that there's been a very public embrace between Trump 0.0 and 2.0 and the president also personally, and key tech sector leaders. And on the whole, I think it's fair to say that the reaction to that from a European perspective has been a fairly alarmed one. There are a variety of reasons for that, but I would kind of highlight two. I mean, the first thing is what I would call the rise of the tech right. We'll get a little bit into kind of what that means and what the key ideas really are, but fundamentally, this is really kind of the rise of a kind of way of political thinking that goes beyond a general kind of Silicon Valley skepticism of tech regulation, and that kind of embraces a strong form of accelerationism, the need to sort of, well, basically make technological progress much faster, and the idea that we also need to comprehensively disrupt and overhaul all types of societal institutions in order to make that happen, including a kind of distinctly anti-democratic bent in certain camps. And I mean, from a European perspective, of course, not only developments such as Elon Musk taking public positions on European politics and especially embracing the right-wing AfD in Germany have made some waves in that regard. There is also a kind of more general perception that this is a project that doesn't only kind of express hostility to the European way of regulating technology, often very precautionary and kind of focused on the regulatory aspect, but that also expresses hostility to the entire idea of the European project, basically as this exemplary of the supposedly overbearing bureaucratic superstate that is everything that these people kind of despise politically. So that's kind of the one thing that's important here. The other is just a growing awareness of tech statecraft and of Europe's vulnerability, and very much speaking to the points that Jeff and Peter have already highlighted. Obviously, in the last few years, the kind of discussions have very strongly also in Europe focused on dependencies vis-a-vis China. I think in that regard, we've, in my view, seen a very kind of salutary development of the debate where we've become much more aware, and I mean, like in an overdue way, aware of the vulnerabilities that some of the economic entanglements we have in this space actually pose to us. But it's also long been known that, of course, that extends to the tech space. I mean, there's been a kind of discussion about European dependencies and European tech sovereignty, basically going back at least to the Snowden revelations. And then, of course, kind of there were various developments over the intervening years that kind of further contributed to that. But that certainly has gained a whole different degree of salience again with the re-election of Donald Trump to the presidency, and kind of these developments that we've been discussing here, up to a point where I would really say that actually at this point, like the European kind of economic and tech security discussion, I wouldn't even describe it still as overwhelmingly focused on China. I think if anything, the focus on China has somewhat been marginalized by these sort of in many people's perception, actually more urgent matters with regard to kind of digital sovereignty and some of the issues facing us in this space here. And a lot of the European commentary on this topic, in my view, rests on two important assumptions. And those are basically those that I kind of, at the heart of this project, wanted to interrogate. The first one is that the tech right, and we'll get into the ideas in greater detail in a second, that is really representative of basically a new consensus, or at least a very dominant force within the tech sector. Like that is kind of basically the strand of thinking that people are really pushing for from the tech industry. And the second thing is that these public displays of proximity, these large dinners, these bilateral meetings between the president and key tech executives, that those are also in themselves indicative of some type of unity of purpose or sway over policy that tech, and by extension then by that logic, the tech right is exercising over US policy. And I mean, just to pick one example here, I thought this kind of essay in the Financial Times in early October by Giuliano D'Empoli exemplifies that type of thinking quite strongly. So like you see the title and the subtitle there. I do recommend reading it. It's an interesting perspective in its own right. But basically, it's kind of about the idea that the tech lords and the populists have entered this alliance that basically tries to sweep away the entire old liberal order and build a new kind of techno-futurist but authoritarian society. And in my view, like, unfortunately, much of this discussion distracts us kind of from what the main challenges really are. And that's why I sort of start stating my main thesis here quite boldly up front. Basically, my argument that I'm going to develop today is that the political economy of US tech statecraft makes a major weaponization of Europe's dependencies in that field still very unlikely, and that to improve its strategic position, Europe should focus much less on dependencies on US tech per se, and much more on building distinctive strengths based on transatlantic tech ecosystems, basically improving that position with improving its position within that ecosystem, doing a better job at capturing value, often leveraging US innovation and technology in the process. And so, I mean, that might come as a bit of a surprise given everything that I've said in the introduction. So how do I get there? I'll basically try to do that in 3 steps. I'll talk a little bit more on what I think a more realistic assessment of what tech, and I kind of put it into scare quotes here because obviously that's not a unitary actor. Sort of what do these actors actually want? The second is sort of how does their interplay with the administration really play out? What are the forms of limits and of tech sector influence under Trump 2.0? And then third, kind of what does that mean for the direction of US tech statecraft that we've seen unfold over the past year and that I expect to continue for the rest of this administration, and what are the resulting options and priorities for Europe. So let's start talking a little bit more about this question, sort of what does the tech sector really want? And I started talking about what are key elements of this tech right thought already briefly in my introduction. I mean, as I've said, I think there are 2 elements that are really important here. The first one is this idea of strong accelerationism. I mean, Peter Thiel, who many people will be aware, has been an important figure in that space. Basically kind of put this in a very pithy way back in, I think, 2011 already in a key essay on that topic, where he basically wrote, look, we were promised flying cars and we got 140 characters. So this idea that basically the entire kind of development in the tech space that we've seen in the past decades, that's actually been really disappointing and kind of falls far short of what kind of humanity's potential is in that space, and that we kind of need to do a better job at kind of really getting to the important and transformative stuff. And then kind of coupled with that, the idea that just our societal institutions are inherently kind of misaligned with this accelerationist vision, and that we need to comprehensively disrupt them, that we basically need to fundamentally change or even sweep away the state bureaucracy, that we might not be able to reconcile this with established forms of democratic control and democratic institutions, and that this kind of really requires a whole different way of thinking about society and the world, often and in recent years increasingly coupled also then with kind of religious ideas basically being infused in there. Sort of there is a lot more to be discussed here, but I'm not going to get deeper into it for the moment. If there are questions, I'm happy to address them in the Q&A. But that's kind of the broad line of thinking here. And then I think it's important to sort of take a step back and look and like how kind of salient are these is this type of thinking really, if we look at kind of the policy related positions that representatives of the US tech sector and different stakeholders in that space are kind of taking and have been taken over the past months. I mean, I think it's fair to say that there has been a degree of embrace of what I would call vaguely accelerationist positions. I think generally speaking, there is a tendency to sort of extol the transformative potential of emerging technologies and especially of AI. I think that has to some extent kind of, at least in the public discourse, come at the expense of what used to be a very prominent line of thinking, namely these AI safety priorities, this concern with catastrophic risk and so on. Like a lot of people in the sector, and especially in the private sector, I would say, are kind of still very concerned with these things, but certainly in the way that they kind of publicly position themselves, like that's become much less of a salient topic. I think right now, if you look at kind of the public positioning of tech companies, AI lab Anthropic probably stands out as sort of the one company that kind of really still sees that as the heart of their mission, whereas many others have sort of vaguely embraced the idea that, especially on AI, kind of moving as fast as possible is really the way to go. Then kind of within that general approach, though, the more specific priorities continue to be shaped to a very large degree then by specific business rationales. And I mean, I'm not going to go through a comprehensive list of actors here, but just to kind of illustrate the space a little bit, I mean, obviously, there is still an important discussion about kind of the extent to which US emerging or kind of cutting edge technology is supposed to be shared with China on that matter, which has been very prominent here in DC throughout the last months. I think NVIDIA has been obviously among the most kind of more active actors in terms of trying to shape the public and political conversation, basically making the case that exporting its technology to China within only very mild boundaries would actually be in the strategic interest of the United States. A company like Meta that isn't actually an AI lab, but kind of engages with AI in the context of its social media platform and related activities, has kind of extolled the importance of open weight, or what they would call open source AI. And sort of like that, basically across the spectrum, I think you do get a lot of the sort of hands-on political priorities that tech sector actors are trying to push in the political space, really being much more sort of explainable in terms of conventional business rationales. And obviously that diversity becomes even greater when you look beyond the main players, because also not everybody in the US is sort of necessarily happy with the idea of having a highly concentrated, consolidated tech sector. There are sort of people who are worried about competition and so on and so forth. So, but just to kind of illustrate what the space of priorities is here. And so then with regard to this idea that basically the tech sector would come in as a force that really pushes back against the European way of governing and kind of the European political project, I mean, I think it's fair to say that there is some open pushback also coming from the tech sector against regulation abroad. If you look at the RFI submissions related to the AI action plan, for example, like there are some sort of fairly open positionings that say, oh, like there is harmful regulation abroad and the US government should sort of try to exercise its influence in order to push back on that. But interestingly, simultaneously, you kind of have these very pronounced efforts toward reassurance, right? In the sense that a lot of US tech companies have actually kind of read the writing on the wall in terms of this tech sovereignty agenda in Europe, and try to basically engage with that in a way that, well, just kind of adjusts their business offer and preserves their possibility to continue doing business in Europe. I mean, the clearest case of that were probably Microsoft's digital commitments in Europe, I think in April this year, which basically suggested a range of steps that Microsoft could take in what it considered the unlikely event that it would be compelled by a political actor to somehow curtail its services to European customers. Other actors such as OpenAI and others have also sort of taken steps in that space, basically trying to offer something that they present as a sovereign version of their kind of technology offer that basically speaks to these European sensibilities. Like, we can talk about the critical reception that has had in some parts of kind of the European camp, pushing very strongly towards a tech sovereignty agenda, but this kind of simultaneous effort is certainly all there. And I think generally speaking, the concern that kind of the European market might actually sort of close to US companies because about concerns about their reliability and about the possibility of their offers being weaponized, be it wittingly or unwittingly on their part, is actually fairly salient among a lot of the providers that really matter there. Then the second layer is kind of the question, sort of what are the forms and limits of tech sector influence, really? And obviously that kind of needs to be refracted through that picture, which I already outlined, which is already more complicated than basically saying, well, all of the tech sector is pushing for very strong kind of tech right positions. So, I mean, I would say there are probably 5 layers of relevant influence that I would distinguish from each other, and I'll try to talk through them very briefly. I mean, the first thing obviously is in a post-citizen United States, like, I mean, money in politics does play a role, political financing does play a role, and obviously tech sector players are important, mainly via the super PAC. So I think there is a degree of kind of dependence also on the part of Trump and his political allies on continued largesse from companies in that space. But I mean, the influence that kind of gets is often abstract, and it's also not at all unique to tech, right? So, like, I mean, there are many industries that are affected by US policy in very different ways, and that all kind of try to basically sort of influence political developments through that mechanism. Then the second thing is kind of what has also been like what's been very prominent and what I think has kind of triggered a lot of the public attention of these high-level interactions. I mean, be it kind of senior tech people being present very prominently at Trump's inauguration, these dinners that we've seen and so on. like these direct exchanges between especially Trump personally and key executives, I mean, they happen quite frequently and they are sometimes consequential. I mean, one key example here, I think, would be the meeting between President Trump and NVIDIA CEO Jensen Huang, which did result in the revocation of some of the export controls that the administration had previously imposed and affecting the company, and where actually sort of the arguments that NVIDIA tries to make in that space did seem to have met some resonance and actually led to an adjustment of policy. But also, I think what's really interesting about a lot of these interactions, that if we kind of look at what's really happening there, it's often marked by an extremely performative deference of tech leaders to the administration, and that's sort of a recognition that ultimately it is really Trump as the political decision maker who is calling the shots here. I mean, if we're kind of looking at the presentation of these gifts, kind of the way that executives carry themselves in these sometimes publicly broadcast meeting as well, and so on. Like, I think it's clear that this is not a situation where kind of you would necessarily discern a kind of complete unity of purpose, and also basically kind of tech sector people being able to exert unconstrained sway over the administration. I mean, there's been a very interesting piece in Wired a few weeks ago where Stephen Levi tried to look into this phenomenon a bit more deeply. And from that, I took this quote here in the second bullet from Michael Moritz, very prominent VC actor in the Silicon Valley, who basically argues that sort of the dominant dynamic in this interaction is really that the tech people are doing their best to avoid being held up in a protection racket in a context where the administration is taking sort of sometimes very unconventional steps of intervening in the economy with the acquisition of stakes in companies, with kind of unconventional regulatory interventions, such as the adjustment to the export controls for NVIDIA that I just mentioned, where basically NVIDIA was allowed to sell certain technology, but only in return for basically giving a share of the revenues to the government and so on. And so obviously there is significant concern among tech leaders about kind of how administration activity might or influence their business prospects for good or ill. And that's driving a lot of this activity, but it's clearly a lot more complicated than just being a conduit for kind of like their own political preferences. Then a third thing is kind of resonance in the political base, where basically sort of tech sector thinking, or kind of especially tech right thinking, is kind of directly broadcast to politically relevant constituencies, and in that way it has a political influence. I mean, obviously this is in some cases very significant. Like there was a reason I think that Elon Musk chose to acquire X, and it does play a very important role in especially right-wing politics in the US these days. But at the same time, I think it's difficult to overstate how precarious the position of especially big tech, but really many people associated with the tech sector and the broader political coalition underpinning Trump's presidency. Like there is pretty open hostility of the self-described national populist strand of MAGA to big tech. Steve Bannon has not been denouncing the broligarchy repeatedly at different occasions. He's also kind of called for the arrest of key tech sector figures, like for example Jensen Huang in this instance, on account of like basically like the suspicion that he's basically an asset of communist China, and that is what is really driving NVIDIA's position on these matters. Few people might have seen a recording from Nick Fuentes a few days ago, where he basically calls for the breakup of the Republican Party in its current forms due to its association with big business and big tech in particular, and calls for a kind of populist revolt against these actors. So, like, I mean, this is a very complicated political coalition in which kind of key tech sector actors are kind of having a very difficult time, or kind of facing considerable complexity, I would say, in terms of navigating. The fourth one, and kind of getting to the last two, which I think are very interesting under the current administration, there is, of course, kind of the question of basically people with tech sector backgrounds occupying important roles within the administration. That is partly the case for some key senior roles, like the most prominent one being David Sachs as kind of the Trump administration's AI czar, with both a kind of substantial background in the VC world in general, and also like well-known, a close personal association with Peter Thiel in this network. There are a few other people kind of at the more senior levels that fit a broadly similar profile. And there is also, I think, an interesting presence throughout the government apparatus of more junior people who either sort of have a similar background themselves or who very clearly sort of share some of the political thinking that is animating the actors that I would kind of subsume more under the tech right umbrella here. Like, I think there it's an interesting question of how consequential that presence really is, partly because of the broader questions about the implementation capacity of this administration in the wake of some of the kind of interventions that have happened in the US bureaucracy itself. Yeah, that is sort of also an interesting and perhaps slightly more complicated dynamic. And then finally, and I think that is in many ways actually the most interesting and consequential way in which the tech sector is shaping US tech statecraft under the current administration, is that it, of course, has an enormous influence on shaping what the perceived and real solution space on many of these questions is. And on that, I'm giving a slightly longer quote here from Dean Ball, the author of the AI Action Plan and a lot of the, or several of the executive orders that basically then sought to operationalize it, who in a blog post last week said the following: "Our strategy rests on the presumption that advanced AI is both possible in the near term and hugely consequential, and that compute is the high order bit to advancing AI." And then the key thing here is this is not so much the government strategy as it is the strategy of the leading AI companies and hyperscalers. And so the idea that kind of the type of US tech statecraft and the priorities that the US would pursue in that space are actually very strongly shaped by the beliefs of kind of the people shaping the development of technology in the private sector themselves and the priorities that they outline. And in many ways, sort of, I think a lot of what the current administration is trying to do is basically sort of to tie into that and get kind of any perceived boundaries or constraints that would hinder the pursuit of these priorities at maximum speed out of the way of these private sector actors. So where does all of this leave us in terms of kind of what US tech statecraft under the Trump administration has actually looked like over the past month? So I would say first thing is the overwhelmingly dominant prism with which people look at these topics is what is often termed the AI race. Sometimes privately people are a bit skeptical about the extent whether to which race is really the right way of framing this, but in any ways, the importance about prevailing over China, over advanced technologies, and the centrality of AI in making that happen. That is kind of really the overwhelming prism through which anything related to tech and global power politics being discussed in DC these days, I think is fundamentally refracted. I think there's been a shift of emphasis from what under the Biden administration would have been called the protect side of the agenda, so export controls, investment controls, these type of things that fundamentally sort of try to withhold cutting edge American technology from China, and a strong shift to the promote side. So the idea that you would need to accelerate the progress both within the US, but also the market share of US technologies globally, that those are really the key priorities in order to exert what the administration often refers to as AI dominance, or kind of dominance more broadly on these tech matters. So I think these elements come out very strongly in both the AI Action Plan that I've already mentioned, and also especially in the executive order on exporting the American AI stack, which I think in many ways is an interesting departure from kind of work that had been happening under the previous administration in terms of its AI diffusion role. Like, people who are deeper into these things sometimes debate on how different or similar some of the thinking behind these things actually is. But certainly the idea that kind of the US should develop AI as fast as possible and also very actively push AI out to the world is a very strong one. And then kind of the interesting bit is sort of to what extent does that extend to China or not, where on the whole, like, you do have kind of powerful voices arguing that kind of exporting the tech to China does actually have strategic merits. That's basically the NVIDIA line of argument. But then you also have kind of a fairly strong coalition of both so-called China hawks and other people who, for various national security related reasons, don't think that's a great idea. But that's kind of really where that debate is. And I mean, then, like, how central is kind of the whole question of kind of how Europe is being governed and how Europe governs tech to this entire debate? In my view, not particularly central at all. I think Europe's largely peripheral to many of these conversations. It's often vaguely assumed or considered to be a highly dependent ally. And sort of, as I've said, like, these instances where kind of you get open calls for regulatory pushback, which are often then explicitly targeted at Europe, so DSA, DMA, AI Act, and so on. like you do get these instances, and it does have a degree of resonance also politically, because at least as far as it relates to the DSA, it is also sometimes put in connection with free speech issues, as it would be termed, as well as with kind of broader concerns about also the dangers of what is sometimes referred to as woke AI and these types of things. So you do get these you do get these calls occasionally, but I would hardly describe them as a priority issue. And ultimately, I think they are kind of then in terms of kind of what also companies really push for in practice, they're often outweighed by the perceived risk that kind of, if you really push for that type of thing, you might sort of, yeah, you might have to be careful what you really wish for, and you might get sort of confrontational dynamics that are not actually at all conducive to business interests of of US companies in Europe. So to conclude, what does that all mean from a German and European perspective? So the first one, and I think that's an important one for me to stress here, is that I consider an outright weaponization of European dependencies on US tech as very unlikely. And I mean, that's not because I sort of somehow dispute the importance of people who might have that agenda, or that I feel that, or that I say, well, these are actually all great people and they kind of don't care about these things. But I think sort of the broad kind of alignment of political economy forces that I've outlined here doesn't speak in favor of that. In my view, I mean, if anything, if somehow like kind of pushing back on kind of on regulation elsewhere in the world really were to become a major kind of concern for US policy, as at one or two moments it seemed that kind of Donald Trump was leaning more sympathetic to that, I also don't think that that is necessarily going to play out in the tech space. I think it's much more likely that if it becomes a priority, this plays out kind of in terms of broader interdependence or interdependence dynamic. We've already seen in the context of the trade and tariff negotiations how basically that is entirely connected with kind of the reliability of US security guarantees in the hard security domain now, and so on. And so if anything, I think the belief that the tech sector has an influential voice under the current administration should lead us to believe that it's less likely for a kind of basically weaponization of dependencies to take place in this particular space. What I would expect very strongly is a further push towards entrenching the use of technologies in Europe, basically completely in line with this agenda of exporting the American AI stack and related technologies. Like, I think sort of explicitly, or in terms of how this executive order is presented, often it is presented as primarily being about middle to low income countries. But of course, the idea that also allies should continue to use US technologies to a maximum extent is sort of implicit in that. And we are sort of seeing that with the tech prosperity deals that, for instance, the UK has concluded with the United States, where of course the use of US technology is actually a very important element. So like that is something that I think Europe has to reckon with, and it has to sort of think about how to deal with it. And I think one consideration that it should take into account in figuring out how to deal with this is that I think we are seeing a sort of trend towards a vertical integration of and consolidation of the US AI and tech landscape more broadly that may complicate the efforts to engage with individual players. Like, I mean, in the said order on, or executive order on exporting the American AI stack, there was this idea to basically ask companies to form consortia in order to have a more kind of integrated offering for third countries. I think that's been discussed a little bit skeptically here in DC, and I think like up to the point where now kind of the author of the author, Dean Ball, has to some extent kind of retracted his thinking on that and said, look, I think it's not really all about kind of creating these consortia, but in the end it is about basically enabling kind of companies to sell their technologies abroad. Also recognizing that companies are fundamentally working towards this integration on their own part anyways, right? Like, I mean, partly because of the investment needs that you have in the US and globally itself, you do have kind of this proliferation of partnerships in all directions between the AI labs, between NVIDIA as the chip designer, between the hyperscalers and so on. So like you do have that kind of very complicated and ever denser mesh between these companies, which does pose concerns from a kind of economic stability perspective, I would argue, but that does also cause concern, or that should at least be kind of something we think about as actors interacting with these players, because I do think it might become more complicated in the future to, for instance, just go to NVIDIA and say, I want to buy a bunch of GPUs from you. Like, you will be confronted with a more kind of comprehensive and perhaps more package that is presented more in terms of, well, take all of it or leave it terms, that ties different layers of the US tech stack together. So that's something to consider. So what do I think should Germany and Europe do? So like in line with what I argue about kind of the role of the weaponization of tech dependencies in kind of the projection of US power globally more broadly, I think the key sort of way of thinking about it is that we really need to holistically strengthen our military and economic capacity to broadly navigate a world of coercive power and unconstrained issue linkages. Like this idea that we can somehow manage the tech dependencies in the tech space, like that's kind of just a mistaken way of thinking about the world in my view. And so even if it might seem slightly unrelated, I think especially reducing kind of the dependencies in the hard security sector that are currently completely dominating any discussion about kind of what the interplay of the different levers in the economic and tech space might be, that is actually a very important part of the overall agenda here. On tech, in my view, the key priority should be to improve our ability to manage interdependence with the US in the stack. I mean, also recognizing the centrality that European players actually like already play at important parts in these technologies. Notably at the equipment and tooling layer for AI chips, where of course ASML and this European kind of network of suppliers continues to play an absolutely essential role. And I think it's an interesting consideration here why actually Europe has not been able to leverage that more strongly also in power political terms. And I think it speaks to the extent to which just the tech sector or kind of tech issues can't be considered in isolation from these broader dynamics also in the hard security space. But then also very importantly to participate in value creation. And that is really sort of the thing that I really would want to stress here, because I think it kind of shapes the overall direction that I would argue to take on that. I think overall, the focus should be much more strongly on developing distinctive strengths in areas like AI for industry, where I think tech sector people in the US here sometimes recognize more strongly than much of the public discourse on this topic in Europe, to what extent Europe is actually in an interesting position to work with these technologies, because it does have a very sophisticated base of advanced industries where AI can actually be used in gainful ways. Like this is not going to be an industry that is fundamentally about chatbots, right? It's about the deployment of automation and kind of intelligent automation across industries in ways that really creates value. And I think in my view, that should really be where kind of the overwhelming majority of attention on the European side should be placed in terms of strengthening the continent economically, using that economic strength to also strengthen its military position and so on and so forth, leaving all of these kind of more narrow kind of tech dependency concerns a little bit marginal. And also, like, I think there is a situation here where sometimes we will face trade-offs between actually working with the available US infrastructure and technology that, for instance, the hyperscalers and the AI labs are offering to us, and kind of prioritizing diversifying the stack or creating European players at that level. Like in my view, if we face a trade-off between basically using US cloud offers or hyperscaler offers to develop these distinctive propositions at higher levels of the stack, like that would, in my view, widely outweigh the importance of basically creating a very powerful European cloud player, even if we had a very strong plan of what that would look like. And so, related to that last point, I think we do need to decide politically whether there are areas where just the mere possibility of US coercion or coercion from any actor for that matter is just unacceptable, and decide what satisfactory mitigation could look like. So even if we think the scenario is very unlikely, we just kind of reject the possibility of that risk entirely. I can see that case being made with regard to public services and anything involving public data. My only thing here is that then if we kind of want to take mitigating measures in that areas, let's avoid excessive complexity and kind of be very clear on kind of what our principles and guardrails actually are. We now see the emergence of these basically assessment frameworks where kind of different models get different kind of sovereignty points for the way that they deal with very specific technical and governance matters and so on. Like, maybe these frameworks have their place, but I think it's actually not particularly helpful to expend a lot of energy on that. I think in that space, we should just have a couple of clear principles and work with them. And then other than that, sort of really focus much of our attention elsewhere, as I have argued. And then kind of the final thing, and that sort of speaks a bit to these kind of competition and concentration dynamics. Like, I think it is important from a European perspective that we embrace scale more strongly and rethink also some of our own European regulation that often makes it difficult for European players to scale to the extent that US players have been able to, mostly on account of how the US market works and how many other parts of the world works. But the one area where I would really argue that we shouldn't unnecessarily relinquish regulatory intervention is in that space of maintaining vital competition rules, notably through the DMA. So like whatever we can do to sort of counteract this growing vertical integration and further consolidation of the tech sector globally, I think that is a very important part of the agenda, and one that I think kind of in the overall scheme of things we will also be able to defend politically. So that is really where I would sort of see the focus of attention here. So with that, I think I conclude, and that should leave us about 20 minutes for some Q&A. Looking forward to your reactions.
Jakob, thank you very much for that terrific presentation. I thought you got at all of the key geoeconomic issues at stake, and I also think your recommendations are likely to provoke quite a bit of useful discussion in Washington as well as in Germany and elsewhere in Europe. So we'll wait for that. But in the meantime, I have one question to start off. You mentioned in your conclusion this issue of kind of the balance of power and in the dependencies, and clearly there's more European dependency on the US and vice versa. But you mentioned ASML, there's also the German firms, Trumpf and Zeiss for lasers and optics. And then in a more broad way, there's the European single market, which you could say that US tech firms are dependent on, for their exports and sales. And you also said that, at least up till now, that the EU hasn't been able to bring to bear sort of this element in their relations with Washington. Nonetheless, do you think that the White House is aware of that the dependency does to a certain degree go in both directions, and do you think that's having any effect on policy?
Yeah, I mean, I think here the question is sort of who specifically do we mean in the White House? I mean, whether the president personally is aware of these things, I'm not sure about, and I can't comment on it. That people working with him on these topics are aware of these things, I would very strongly presuppose, and in some cases I've also seen some strong evidence of that. So that I think is definitely. I mean, I think anybody working in this space is very aware of the centrality of ASML. You've mentioned these two other German firms that are basically part of kind of ASML's supplier network, or kind of also technology co-development network, and like the centrality of that, like, and it's interesting because I mean also we talk about these choke points at different levels, and interesting work has been done on how strong some of these choke points are. I mean, this is not just one thing among many. Like, that is probably the single strongest technology choke point that we know in the world. Like, even things like, say, for example, the dependencies in the rare earth space, they are also potentially very existential and far-reaching. But on the whole, like, it's much more likely that both Europe and the United States will be able to replicate some type of rare earth processing industries then that it would be easily possible for Chinese competitors to replicate these unique capabilities that European companies have developed in that space, and for US competitors to do the same, frankly. So like this really is a very strong potential source of leverage if this were a game that is fundamentally about technology interdependencies. And I think that just goes to sort of support my argument about the fact that, like, you can't look at this as an isolated space. And in the end, all of these things are, in my view, currently subordinate. Like, I mean, if the high-level discussion basically within 2 or 3 iterations always goes to questions about US support to Ukraine, US support to the credibility of Article 5 and NATO, and so on, like, this will always overshadow anything that happens in that space. But I think kind of then among the people who are looking more concretely at these technology interdependencies, certainly the dependency also of US actors on European inputs at the tooling and equipment level are very salient. And as I have argued, like, I wouldn't perhaps describe the European market access as a source of strong dependency, but I mean, surely it is a significant lever, and it is a force that, in my view, very strongly shapes the actual positions of many tech sector players in terms of what they are pushing for and what I think also the administration reasonably considers to be in the US interest in that space.
Thank you. Let me remind viewers, if you want to ask a question, please use the Q&A button, and I'll get them to Jakob. One more from me. Maybe this is a little blue sky, and I'm not sure if it's a commercial or a political question, really. But you mentioned the pushback we've seen from both the administration to a certain degree, and from maybe rhetorically from some companies or individuals in the tech sector, if not necessarily all. You mentioned Microsoft's very public announcement in April. Why this emphasis on the EU's ecosystem and regulations, and why do we, at least from what I can tell, hear so little from tech companies about China and about sort of their regulations and because, as you said, there is a desire still to sell to a certain degree into that market, right? So you would think that a company that's exporting there would be concerned about regulations in all markets they sell to, but it's really, it seems EU is really is the focus. And I just wanted to step back and wonder why that is and why China sort of doesn't get that attention.
Yeah, I mean, I think just China occupies a very different place in kind of the US analysis of where the world is heading and kind of what the role of different stakeholders will be, right? Like, I mean, I think basically, yeah, any administration in living in recent decades, and basically across sort of otherwise pretty sharp contrasts, especially between Trump 1, Biden, Trump 2. Like, I mean, that's kind of an area of continuity that China has been identified as the sole potential peer competitor, and really kind of the like basically threat to US preeminence in that space. And I think that's very much a position that Europe is not seen in. And I think that kind of shapes that conversation. I mean, you're right that there are US actors who still want to sell technology to China. I mean, at this point, at least in the tech space, in my view, that is very largely concentrated on NVIDIA. I mean, of course, kind of you do have it at other layers in terms of social media, some other apps, and so on as well. But nevertheless, like, I mean, I think sort of the idea that kind of basically shaping access to the Chinese market would be US priority, that's just something that kind of most people here would, in my perception, consider as pretty implausible, because that's just fundamentally not where the relationship with that country is going, right? Whereas I think with Europe, like, I mean, people don't necessarily perhaps even see it as a particularly important actor in this emerging space, but to the extent that it matters from a US perspective, it matters as a potential market, and it matters as a ally in broad sense, and often it's presumed that that will kind of persist irrespective of where US policy is heading on many other things. And so I think that naturally then kind of predisposes the discussion to focus on these things, and this idea that that is sort of a space where we really care about what regulation looks like. And I mean, also, of course, that has to do with the fact, I mean, I'm hesitant to talk about the Brussels effect, because I think sometimes the idea that kind of European regulation has that very powerful sway also over different parts of the world, like that has led some of our European thinking on these matters astray. But nevertheless, I mean, there is something about it in the sense that European regulation is often the template for also what happens in other parts of the world. And in that sense, it's influential. I think there is a concern about kind of that Chinese standards and perhaps also regulation in a broad sense might play that role in the future. But I think the way that US stakeholders overwhelmingly think is the right way to deal with that is not by trying to influence Chinese regulation, which I think they rightly assess as something that is not within the purview of what the US can accomplish, but by basically sort of just pushing back on Chinese influence anywhere in the world. And that's where this whole exporting the American AI stack agenda comes from, this idea that now is the time to lock in the use of American technology also elsewhere and marginalize Chinese influence on that account.
Yeah, I think that's interesting how you answer that, because you're saying on the one, there's three hands. On the first, you say that well, the EU is influenceable in a way that China is not, and that's fair enough. But you also said that the US does want to reserve the option of the EU being an ally, and then the perception from this administration is that the EU would be a better ally, I guess, the more it's aligned with the US in the regulatory space. But then third, what you said about the Brussels effect would seem to suggest that there is a certain respect for the EU's kind of economic statecraft, that in fact regulations, they really make a difference, and there's a certain power projection that comes from that. So it's an interesting mix, I think, the way you answered.
Yeah, and I mean, perhaps just to briefly elaborate on that point, I mean, I think sort of the whole idea that you would be particularly hostile to the European project, like from the point of view of people who sort of take that line, like, I mean, that kind of only makes sense if you do think that actor does actually have some influence in that space, right? I mean, if it doesn't matter, then why do you care so much about it? So in that sense, like I think that recognition is definitely there. And I mean, perhaps to kind of just throw one final thing in here, I mean, I think the debate about kind of regulatory alignment and where all of that is heading is also an interesting one. I mean, we'll see sort of how some of the omnibus simplification in Europe will resonate here in the United States. I think generally sort of at a very broad level, and I think sometimes also with excessive generalization, we now have that signaling from the European side, yes, we're rethinking some of our regulation and so on and so forth. I think in some areas that really makes sense. In other areas, for instance, on the DMA, I would strongly speak out against it. But I mean, at the same time, the US regulatory discussion also remains interesting, right? Like, I mean, we're currently seeing a fair bit of movement on the question of preemption in terms of whether the federal level can somehow preclude the state level from actually imposing regulation, as has already happened in California and elsewhere. And I mean, right now, regulatorily, the US is in an interesting space because there does seem to be political demand for some type of regulation, especially of AI, that is very strongly felt at the state legislation level. Like the federal level doesn't want it, but sort of seeing how that plays out is interesting. And you see some of even the tech sector players coming out and say, look, actually, we want a degree of clarity on the federal level of what the guardrails are so that we can do without this kind of multitude of different regulatory regimes at the state level. So I think that's also where in a sense, it's not only kind of one side adjusting in one direction.
Right. Right. So we have two questions that have come in, so let's try to get to both of them. First, one of them is, how would you assess how the current administration has already changed U.S. state business relations? And has it done so not just through its discursive power, but also materially? And would you say this is more based on domestic considerations or responses to global economic reordering?
I mean, I think the material realignment is very important. And I mean, I've talked about some of these instances of basically the state taking a stake in US companies, both in the tech sector, but importantly also in the critical raw material space. And I mean, I think we have to argue the merits of these interventions very carefully for each individual case, because at least for the critical minerals one, like I personally very much see that, and I would honestly want to see similar action on the European side as well. But I mean, yes, there is definitely sort of significant movement there. And I mean, I think it sort of speaks to some of the countervailing strands of economic doctrine and thinking that you kind of have within the coalition that is carrying that president. And I mean, right now, like, I mean, sort of this idea that you kind of really also need forceful state intervention to achieve your political economic objectives, that seems to be the notion that is really winning out. And I mean, whether that is ultimately domestically driven or internationally driven, I mean, hard to say. Like, I mean, it comes from domestic stakeholders, but I think these domestic stakeholders analysis is often, I mean, it's based on what I think is a reasonable assessment of what a world looks like, in which there is a very powerful state capitalist actor, China, that is operating in a completely different way than the actors for which the current global trading and economic order was drafted, and that will require adjustments on our part of economic governance as well. And so in that sense, I think it's an interplay of global and national forces.
Great, thank you. Another question asks, or starts by saying that the disruption of state bureaucracy appears to be a shared objective of both the so-called tech right and certain more moderate political movements. The latter, however, tend to pursue this goal in the interest of enhancing economic resilience. And then his question is, therefore, whether the distinction lies solely in the ends to which this endeavor is directed, or whether there are deeper structural commonalities and divergences between these two movements that are described?
Yeah, interesting. I mean, look, I think you can come to the conclusion that we need reforms and perhaps significant change in our state bureaucracy from very different vantage points, right? Like, I mean, this can come from a kind of very technocratic, like what's the best way of doing things? To what extent can we perhaps leverage efficiencies that perhaps have been better accomplished in the way the private sector has been organizing its bureaucracies? I mean, all arguable points, but like, I mean, that's kind of one way of coming at it. I mean, the other one is, of course, a kind of very ideological, like we're just opposed to state power per se. We're opposed to the deep state and the subversion of the actual political will of the people by the bureaucracy and so on. And so, I mean, in that sense, I think there are different people who might make superficially related arguments for very different reasons. I mean, even and I mean, then again, it's sort of an interesting question of where you see sort of people heading in general, right? Like I think even among people who kind of come with more of a sort of tech sector mindset and who are on board with this whole accelerationist vision, I don't think that necessarily means that they also need to be fully on board with the sort of anti-democratic sweeping away the state kind of or sort of transformative societal change just as an end in its own right camp. I mean, often you do get also instrumental arguments on how kind of just improving the bureaucracy will be important to sort of fully realize these technological and economic benefits, and that will be in the strategic interest of the US and so on and so forth. So I think you get very kind of different strands of people arguing these things. And I mean, like, I think perhaps one thing that I should also stress as we're kind of closing this, I mean, like none of what I've presented here, I want to be understood as sort of denying the importance of these sometimes very radical strands of novel political thoughts that we're seeing in the US. Like, I think this is a very important space to watch, and kind of depending on the influence that a few key players will really acquire, like that like that is a very important force in US politics, right? I'm just kind of sort of trying to put some nuance to the way that it's refracted through the political economy of statecraft at the present moment, and what I think that means for the foreseeable future. But nevertheless, like there is a lot to be looked into kind of in terms of these strands of thinking and what kind of animates them and why they get resonance in certain quarters.
Okay, let's close out with one last question. When you look at the European economic investment and regulatory landscape, do you believe greater policy engagement by European governments is needed, especially in the countries whose companies play important roles in the value chain or at the EU level?
Sorry, like more regulatory engagement. Can you repeat that part?
You know,
of the question?
is it sort of a country issue or more of an EU level when you look at the kind of initiatives that need to be taken in Europe going forward?
I mean, I think by default, my answer to that question would always be to look more at the European level, because I think especially on everything on tech matters, scale matters enormously, and on that kind of, to the extent that we can get unified action at the European level, that would always be the sort of natural focus of attention for me. I mean, obviously that then speaks kind of the complexity of European politics these days as well. Like, I mean, fundamentally, I think it's desirable to have these things happen at the European level. It's not always easy to sort of build the coalitions to make that happen. And it's not always easy to build these coalitions in a way that doesn't really undermine the whole purpose of the policy, right? Like, and I think, unfortunately, especially on tech-related matters, that is too often what we see, that programs get designed in a way that basically tries to already prefigure some geographical allocation of where the data centers are going to stand and so on. And like, to my mind, like that really speaks to a type of parochialism that we can't afford at this point in kind of the situation that Europeans currently find themselves confronted with. But I mean, you need to work with the political realities that you're facing, right? And so in the end, if that movement kind of doesn't happen or it doesn't happen fast enough in the right direction, then we need to do what we can at the national level. And I mean, within that, and I'm not sure whether that was kind of meant in the question or not. I mean, I do think sort of that the entire question of how we organize the interface between the private sector and kind of state action on these matters remains extremely important, and that we really, I mean, we haven't patently found kind of the best ways of doing this, both in terms of kind of the consultation level and really just gathering techno-industrial intelligence from the private sector. Like there are, I think, huge potential for improvements and need for improvements in that space, but also in terms of thinking through sort of what could novel policies and governance arrangements actually look like, what types of state interventions might we have to go with to sort of survive in that type of environment. Like I think a lot of thinking and rethinking is required, certainly kind of also in a German context among people who come with a very strong ordoliberal sort of mindset and might be skeptical about some of the interventions that others might propose here. I think you're muted, Peter.
Thank you for that last note as we conclude. Again, appreciate this deep dive on these tech statecraft issues. It's an issue we'll going to build on even after you finish up your stay with AGI. So we look forward to staying in touch with you about that. And I also want to thank all of the viewers who tuned in, and thank you for your questions, which also contributed, I think, to the richness of the debate. So enjoy the rest of your day wherever you are, and thanks again. Bye-bye.
Thanks very much.